Good evening. I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. After 28 years in the skies, I thought I'd seen every kind of passenger. I was wrong. Tonight, let me tell you what happened on Flight 815. Seattle to Atlanta, 7:40 departure. First class, nearly full. The terminal buzzed with the last rush of evening travelers, rolling suitcases clattering over tile, a gate agent's voice cutting through the noise to call final boarding groups. Elias Coleman moved through the jet bridge with the unhurried calm of a man who had flown this route more times than he could count. 45 years old, founder and CEO of Solari Systems, a company that had spent the last decade building AI software designed to catch fraud and threats before they ever became a headline. He wore a charcoal sport coat over a plain white shirt, no tie, a battered leather briefcase in one hand, the strap worn soft from years of the same daily grip. It was the kind of understated look that made him easy to overlook in a room full of people trying hard to be noticed, and that had always suited him just fine. He handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, who scanned it without comment, barely glancing up before waving him through. He stepped onto the aircraft. Seat 2A, window. He'd flown this exact route 11 times in the past year alone, ever since Falcon Airways had opened serious talks with Solari about a partnership that could change how every major airline in the country screened for risk, moving decisions away from a stranger's gut feeling and towards something measurable, defensible, and fair. He settled into his seat, stowed his briefcase beneath the one in front of him, and pulled out his tablet, reviewing the final terms of a $3.2 billion six-year contract. Solari's AI would be woven directly into Falcon's ticketing, boarding, and cargo security systems, flagging genuine threats in real time instead of relying on instinct at a gate. The irony of that fact would not become clear to him for another 40 minutes, though looking back later, he'd wonder how he hadn't seen it coming from the moment he sat down. 2 rows behind him, a man named Roger Aldridge settled into 4C, glancing repeatedly toward the front of the cabin, his knee bouncing with a nervous energy he couldn't quite explain, even to himself. Roger was a mid-level insurance underwriter flying home from a conference, and 3 weeks earlier, his identity had been stolen and used to open 2 credit lines in Ohio. He'd spent the better part of a month untangling the mess with banks and credit bureaus, jumping at anything that felt unfamiliar, anyone who seemed to be watching too closely, working too quietly, holding something back. It wasn't malice. It was fear wearing the costume of vigilance, and Roger had no idea how thin the line between the two had become for him lately. Elias wasn't watching anyone. He was reviewing slide 17 of a deck he knew by heart, occasionally murmuring numbers to himself, the way people do when they're rehearsing a presentation silently in their head, lips barely moving. A flight attendant named Priya Shah stopped by his row with a warm, practiced smile. "Can I get you anything before we push back, Mr. Coleman?" "Water's fine, thank you," Elias said, glancing up with a brief smile before returning to his screen. Roger leaned toward his seatmate, an older woman absorbed in a crossword puzzle. "He's been on his phone the whole time, whispering numbers. You see that?" His seatmate shrugged, uninterested, not even lifting her pen from the page. Roger didn't let it go. When Priya passed through the cabin again, he flagged her down. "That man in 2A, Roger said, keeping his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "He keeps checking his phone, kind of nervous, whispering to himself. I don't know, something feels off about him." Priya glanced toward 2A, where Elias sat calmly reviewing a spreadsheet, utterly unremarkable in every visible way, dressed no differently than half the cabin. "He's a frequent flyer, sir. I've served him before, more than once." "I'm just saying," Roger pressed, his voice tightening. "Maybe somebody should check, just to be safe." Priya didn't want to dismiss a passenger's concern outright. That much was drilled into every crew member from their very first day of training. But she also didn't see anything resembling a genuine threat in front of her. Nothing beyond a man quietly working through a presentation like 100 other business travelers she'd served that same week. Still, procedure required her to note it and pass it along to the purser, just in case. A small formality she assumed would end there. She didn't expect what happened next. The purser relayed Roger's comment to the gate supervisor still stationed near the jet bridge, a young man named Curtis Beale, who had been on the job for 4 months and had never once had to make a judgment call like this on his own. Nervous about getting it wrong in either direction, more afraid of being blamed for missing something than of overreacting, he radioed for 2 members of the airport's contracted security team to do what he called a quick welfare check before final boarding closed. It felt, in that moment, like the safer choice. 2 men in navy blazers walked down the aisle, weaving past a flight attendant restocking the beverage cart. Passengers glanced up, then quickly looked away, the particular silence of people who don't want to be involved, settling over the cabin like a held breath. The men stopped at row 2. "Sir, we need you to step off the aircraft with us," one said. his voice pitched just loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear clearly, whether he meant it that way or not. Elias looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. "Is there a problem with my ticket? We just need to verify a few things. If you could grab your bag and come with us." I scanned my boarding pass. I showed ID at the gate. His voice stayed even, controlled, the tone of a man who had learned decades ago that raising it would only give people a reason to stop listening, a reason to describe him later as difficult instead of reasonable. "What exactly needs verifying?" Neither man answered directly. One simply gestured toward the aisle again, the silence itself doing the talking in a way words never could. Elias closed his tablet, gathered his briefcase, and stood, straightening his jacket with the same unhurried composure he brought into every boardroom he'd ever walked into. Roger, 2 rows back, suddenly found something fascinating in the seat-back pocket in front of him and refused to look up, his ears burning. Nobody on that plane said a word in Elias's defense. Nobody asked why, or what he'd done, or whether this was really necessary. Elias walked the length of the cabin himself, the eyes of 40 strangers following him without a single voice rising to interrupt what was happening in front of them. Off the plane, in a small corridor beside the gate, the questions began, delivered in the flat, procedural tone designed to feel official without ever quite becoming one. Name, purpose of travel, employer. Elias answered each one flatly, giving nothing more than what was asked, watching both men carefully, until the second man reached the final question. "And what does your company do, exactly?" "We build risk detection software," Elias said, holding the man's gaze without blinking. "Fraud prevention, threat analytics, real-time flagging systems built to replace exactly this kind of guesswork. As a matter of fact, Falcon Airways is 3 weeks from signing a contract with my company to run this exact security process through our AI instead of a stranger's gut feeling in row 4. The silence that followed had weight to it, physical almost, pressing down on the narrow corridor. The 2 men exchanged a look neither of them could hide fast enough. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding," the taller one said, his voice losing some of its earlier certainty. "No," Elias replied quietly. "There's been a decision. Somebody made it, and somebody should be able to explain it to me. I'd like to speak with your supervisor." A gate supervisor named Diane Okafor arrived within minutes, apology already loaded before she'd even reached him, her clipboard clutched tight against her chest. "Mr. Coleman, I am so sorry. There was a report of suspicious behavior, and our team followed standard protocol in responding to it." "Whose report?" Elias asked. Diane hesitated, glancing briefly toward the plane still parked at the gate behind her. "I can't disclose that, sir, but I promise you this will be looked into thoroughly." "I don't need a promise," Elias said, his tone calm but unmistakably firm. "I need to know what 'suspicious' meant in this case, because as far as I can tell, I was reviewing a spreadsheet in an aisle seat." She didn't have an answer for that, and the silence that followed told him she probably never would, not from this conversation anyway. She offered him a voucher for the next available flight and a meal credit, both of which he declined without raising his voice or making a scene. He didn't storm off. He didn't demand names shouted down the hallway for everyone to hear. He walked instead to a quiet bench near the gate, sat down, opened his laptop, and started writing, first to his general counsel, then to his head of communications, then to the one man at Falcon Airways he actually trusted after 8 months of negotiations, the deal's lead negotiator, Grant Whitfield. By the time Elias boarded a later flight to Atlanta that evening, 3 tech blogs had already picked up a passenger's shaky phone video from the cabin, 40 seconds of him standing, gathering his bag, and walking off a plane in complete silence, while a security escort waited at the front of the aisle. The caption read simply, "Black CEO removed from first class over suspicious behavior. No explanation given." By morning, it would have thousands of shares, and by the following afternoon, a handful of national outlets would pick it up too. What stayed with Elias wasn't the humiliation of the walk itself, though that had cut deeper than he wanted to admit even to himself. It was the quiet. 40 people, and not one of them had asked a single question out loud. Not one had stood up. Not one had said, "Wait, why him?" He thought about his father, a postal worker in Cleveland, who used to say the same thing every time something like this happened to somebody they knew. "Keep your head down. Don't give them a reason." Elias had spent 20 years building a company specifically so he'd never have to live by that rule again, so his daughter would grow up never needing to learn it the way he had. Yet here he was, stepping off a plane in a tailored coat, $3.2 billion deal in his briefcase, and the rule still somehow applied. He texted his wife, Renata, one line. "Landed late. Long story. I'll call you after the meeting tomorrow." She didn't push, didn't fire back a dozen worried questions the way she might have years earlier. She'd heard that particular tone in his voice before, the flat calm he used when something had cut deeper than he was ready to talk about yet, and she knew better than to chase it before he was ready to give it to her. He sat with his laptop closed for a long while before boarding the later flight, watching travelers move through the terminal, families reuniting near the escalators, a group of college kids laughing over spilled coffee. Nobody in that terminal knew what had just happened 40 feet away. Nobody would have believed, looking at him, that he'd just been walked off a plane like a suspect instead of a passenger. That gap between what people saw and what had actually happened was the whole problem in miniature. The next morning, Elias walked into Falcon Airways Atlanta headquarters for a meeting that had been scheduled for weeks, the final sign-off on the $3.2 billion partnership, the kind of meeting that usually ended in handshakes and a bottle of something expensive. Around the table sat the airline's chief operating officer, its general counsel, and the deal's lead negotiator, a man named Grant Whitfield, who looked like he hadn't slept, dark circles under his eyes, coffee going cold at his elbow. "Elias, I heard what happened," Grant said before anyone else could speak, half rising from his chair. "I don't have words for how sorry I am. We've already pulled the incident reports." "I don't need sorry," Elias said, taking his seat at the head of the table without waiting to be invited, setting his laptop down with deliberate calm. "I need you to understand what actually happened last night, because it isn't a customer service issue. It's the exact failure this contract is supposed to fix." He opened his laptop and turned the screen toward the room, the same slide deck he'd been reviewing on the plane less than 24 hours earlier. "A passenger felt uneasy because I was quiet and working on a spreadsheet. That feeling got escalated by a supervisor with 4 months of experience, with no real criteria, no data, nothing beyond a stranger's discomfort, turned into a phone call. That is precisely the kind of subjective judgment call Solari's system was built to remove from your boarding process entirely." The chief operating officer, a sharp-eyed woman named Carol Diaz, leaned forward, her pen frozen mid-note. "You're saying our own gap in the system is the reason this happened to you specifically. I'm saying it happened to me on a plane operated by an airline that is 3 weeks from paying my company $3.2 billion to prevent exactly this kind of error," Elias said, his voice never rising above a level, deliberate calm. "If I can't trust your people to treat me fairly without an algorithm watching over their shoulder, why on earth would I trust that algorithm to be built and deployed with fairness in mind at all? The software is only as good as the values of the people who design and run it." Nobody in the room had an answer ready. Grant looked down at the table. The general counsel scribbled something on a legal pad and then crossed it out. "I'm not walking away from the deal," Elias continued, and the tension in the room shifted slightly, shoulders easing a fraction. "But I'm not signing it as written either. I want the contract to include a mandatory bias and equity audit of every boarding and security decision made under this system, reviewed quarterly by an independent panel, not your legal team. I want a public incident report published every time a passenger is removed under suspicion, with the actual criteria disclosed to the public, not buried in an internal file. And I want the gate supervisor's entire chain of command retrained before this software ever touches your boarding gates, because software built on top of the same blind judgment it's supposed to replace won't fix anything. It'll just make the same mistake move faster and harder to challenge." Grant exchanged a glance with Carol. "That's a significant restructure this close to signing, Elias. The board will have questions." "It's a significant amount of money," Elias said evenly, closing his laptop halfway. "I'd like it to buy something real, not just a headline about a new partnership." Word of the incident had already reached Falcon's board by the time the meeting ended, spreading through the company faster than any internal memo could have contained it, and by early afternoon, a second airline had reached out. Atlas Air's CEO, a woman named Denise Trumbull, called Elias directly, her voice smooth and urgent, offering to fast-track a competing contract with none of the new conditions attached. A clean, uncomplicated deal, twice the timeline he'd need to walk away from Falcon entirely and start fresh somewhere that hadn't just humiliated him in front of 40 strangers. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no either. He told her he'd think about it, and he meant it, because for a few hours that afternoon, sitting alone in a hotel room overlooking the Atlanta skyline, walking away felt like the simplest and most satisfying kind of justice available to him. No more audits to negotiate, no more retraining schedules to fight for, just a clean exit and a headline that would embarrass Falcon Airways for years to come. What changed his mind wasn't the money, and it wasn't Denise Trumbull's offer either. It was a phone call from Priya Shah, the flight attendant from the night before, who had tracked down his office number through a mutual contact at the airline and asked, hands visibly shaking as she dialed, whether she could speak with him directly, off the record if he preferred. "I should have said something on the plane," she told him, her voice tight. I noticed the man's comment didn't add up, and I told the supervisor it seemed thin, but he made the call anyway, and I let it go instead of pushing back harder. I've been sick about it all day, replaying it. Elias listened without interrupting, letting her get all the way through it. Did you tell Miss Okafor that this morning? Yes. I wrote a full statement. I wanted the record to be honest, whatever that costs me with the company. That single act, a young flight attendant choosing honesty over self-protection when it would have been so much easier to stay quiet, told him more about what was actually fixable inside Falcon Airways than any executive apology had managed to. Systems weren't only broken by the people who made bad calls under pressure in the moment. They were kept broken, or they were repaired, depending entirely on whether the people underneath those calls were willing to tell the truth about them afterward, even when nobody was forcing them to. He called Grant back that evening, standing at the window with the city lights spread out below him. "I'm not taking Atlas Air's offer," he said, "but every condition I named this morning stays in the contract, in writing, or there's no deal at all. Not a watered-down version. Exactly what I said." Falcon's board approved every term within 48 hours, faster than any revision in the company's history, motivated in equal parts by genuine conscience and by the very real fear of losing the technology to a competitor for good, a fear that had nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with the bottom line. Curtis Beale, the young supervisor, wasn't fired. Elias had specifically asked that he not be made a scapegoat for a system that had failed long before he ever picked up his radio to make that call. Instead, Curtis went through the same equity retraining Elias had demanded for every boarding supervisor in the company, and months later, he was the one who caught and correctly de-escalated a nearly identical false alarm before it ever reached a passenger's row, asking the right questions instead of reaching for security. Priya Shah was promoted into a newly created role overseeing crew training for the rollout, the first of its kind at any major airline, built specifically around her insistence that honesty mattered more than comfort, even when honesty meant admitting her own mistake out loud. Roger Aldridge never learned Elias's name, and Elias never sought him out. There was no confrontation, no public shaming, no attempt to identify him to the press. Elias had thought about it, briefly, in the hours right after the video went viral, but decided against it. Roger hadn't acted out of hatred, he'd acted out of a fear that had nothing to do with Elias at all, and everything to do with a stolen identity and a month of sleepless nights. Punishing him wouldn't have fixed anything. Fixing the system that let his fear become someone else's public humiliation, that was the only version of justice Elias actually wanted. 3 months later, Elias boarded Flight 815 again, same route, same seat, 2A, carrying the same battered briefcase with its softened leather straps. This time, a small card sat waiting on his tray table, printed on Falcon Airways letterhead. "Thank you for holding us to something better." No fanfare, no press camera waiting at the gate, no executive greeting him at the jet bridge for a photo opportunity, just a short note left by a crew that had quietly changed how it operated, one gate and one training session at a time. Priya worked the flight that day too, in her new training role, observing rather than serving drinks, a laptop tucked under her arm instead of a beverage cart. When she saw him settle into his seat, she came over, pausing at the end of the row. "I wanted you to know," she said. "We ran the new protocol for the first time last week. A passenger raised a concern about someone 2 rows back. My team asked 3 specific questions before anyone was flagged. Not a feeling, actual criteria written down on a checklist. It turned out to be nothing at all. Nobody got pulled off that plane." Elias nodded slowly, something in his chest loosening just slightly. "That's the whole point. Not that nothing ever gets flagged again. That when it does, it's for a real reason. Something you could explain to the person you're flagging without flinching." She smiled, something easing in her posture that hadn't been there the night she'd called him, shaking, to admit she'd stayed quiet when it mattered most. 40 minutes into the flight, nothing happened at all. No security team walked down the aisle. No stranger whispered about a spreadsheet 2 rows up. Just the ordinary hum of a cabin full of people minding their own business. The clink of ice in a glass. Someone's laptop fan whirring quietly. Exactly the kind of unremarkable flight Elias had wanted the whole time. Not headlines, not apologies delivered under fluorescent lights, just a system that worked the same way for everyone sitting inside it. I spoke with Mr. Coleman briefly at the gate that evening after we landed, shook his hand, and asked him what the last 3 months had taught him about people. He thought about it for a moment before answering, choosing his words carefully the way I imagine he chose every word in that boardroom. He said the failure was never really about one nervous passenger or one inexperienced supervisor working his first year on the job. It was about how easy it is for a system to let quiet bias move faster than the truth, unless somebody with enough standing insists on slowing it down long enough to get it right, and unless somebody underneath that system is brave enough to admit when they got it wrong. At 35,000 feet, every passenger buckles the same belt, drinks from the same cart, and trusts the same crew to get them home safely. It's the people willing to tell the truth when it costs them something, not the ones with the loudest voice in the room, who actually keep that trust intact. I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. Thanks for flying with me tonight. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. There's another flight waiting.